Let your light shine upon us this morning that we may truly see and understand and look within our hearts and carefully examine what you see, O Lord. Speak to us. Touch us. Let your word feed us this morning. And let your Holy Spirit manifest itself in our lives by reminding us of who we are. We have been called to be light and salt. We stand before your presence. We stand before your presence this morning. Amen. I won't be preaching about 12 years a slave. We're going to have to ask Pastor Jackson to preach about that when he comes back. Instead, I've titled my sermon, the Uh-Oh Sermon. I think it's safe to assume that none of you came to church today hoping for a good sermon on anger, adultery, or divorce. I also think that it is safe to assume that the advice that Jesus gives to tear out one's eye or to cut off one's hand if it becomes a vehicle for sinning does not seem like the most appropriate way or the most positive way to think about Christian life. No doubt the passage from Matthew is a very interesting, albeit complex one, that needs to be examined from a variety of angles so that we can better interpret it and understand it so that it can ultimately be useful for our daily lives. Let me give you an example of another interpretation of this passage. I read the story of a college student at a Bible college who lived in a shared dorm setting, and when she would go out on a date on Friday night and have a fabulous meal, she would carefully eat only half of her meal so she could enjoy the rest of it the next day for lunch. But when she would open up the door to the refrigerator anticipating the content of that delicious doggy bag, the leftovers would be gone, along with anything else that might have been edible in the refrigerator. This continued to happen until one morning when she woke up and she went to the kitchen to fetch some milk for her coffee, and she gasped. Someone had taped a sign to the refrigerator door. In bold letters it said, "If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off," and then carefully taped to the sign with a fierce, serrated edge knife. I suppose that this is one way to interpret the text. But I suggest that we look at another way and go in another direction by listening to the conversation between Jesus and his disciples. In this week's reading, like the passage from last week about salt and light, we follow the Beatitudes, which are the form of the Sermon on the Mount. And in this passage this morning, we find no parables, we find no miracles, we only find straightforward teaching. Jesus telling his disciples, do this. Jesus is the teacher, bridging familiar lessons from Jewish teachings in his own ministry as he instructs his disciples in the demands of a Jesus-following life. We can divide this passage into three different parts, and each of these parts begins with the words, "You have heard it said." It might be good at the outset to pay attention to who exactly was doing the speaking in that case. We have heard it said, where and by whom. While those who normally went about reminding people of all the rules and regulations that they had to follow were the religious leaders of the community. In Jesus' case, the scribes and the Pharisees. And the Pharisees in particular were very concerned with the correct observances of the law. Pharisees tended to be the face of religious law enforcement in the community. So the phrase, "you have heard it said," strongly implies a second statement by the scribes and Pharisees. Some have thought that Jesus' statements in this discourse, "you have heard it said," followed "but I say to you," are an example of Jesus contrasting or even replacing prior Jewish teachings on his own. But we must take these contrasts, and think of them in a different way. For Jesus neither erases nor does he discount the teachings of the law. Remember that in the section from Matthew that we read last Sunday, Jesus clearly states, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law." What we encounter in the reading from today's passage in Matthew is a full engagement of Jesus with his heritage. We might even say that this is a family conversation, and we all know how lively family conversations can be. Here we find Jesus adding his wisdom to the wisdom of the ages. And then things seem to get very interesting because Jesus seems to out-legalize the legalists. Jesus uses the traditional teachings on murder, adultery, and prayer as essential grounds for building his case for living a life of righteousness. Using familiar, perhaps even too familiar teachings, Jesus intensifies and radicalizes them for his listeners, extending these teachings into almost every area of life. It seems that Jesus went a little crazy. His speech is so radical, so full of hyperbole. However, a careful reading of the text shows us that in this way, Jesus does not abolish the law, but fulfills it. No longer do the teachings on murder and adultery apply strictly to acts of murder and adultery. Instead, they become doorways into the examination of the many internal dynamics as well as external behaviors of one's life. Anger, slander, false generosity, litigiousness, arrogance, lust, temptation, alienation, divorce, religious speech. Jesus connects the dots for his listeners from the outward acts to internal orientation. Jesus wants people to look beyond the external action, which is very easy to see, and instead to focus on internal motivation, that which is hidden from the human eye. Jesus shifts the focus from murder to anger, from adultery to lust. It is one thing to behave rightly, but it is another thing entirely for one's heart to be oriented toward love. Just as it is easier to make a sacrifice at the temple than it is to do justice, so it is easier to keep the commandment against murder than it is to avoid anger in one's heart. We begin to see that what Jesus is saying is that our relationships and that how we behave towards one another, that ways we treat one another, these matter to God. God is paying attention. They matter to God because we matter to God. In this teaching, Jesus offers a more radical ethic, what we can call a reign of God ethic. The righteousness of this newly inaugurated kingdom of God is so much more than following rules. It requires and empowers a life that is surrendered to God and surrendered to neighbor. Jesus knows that we humans have a great capacity to fool ourselves into thinking that things are okay when they really are not. That our lives and the ethic that guides our lives is in accordance with an obedient discipleship when this may not be the case. But it is often hard to tell us otherwise. Which is why I think Jesus uses images in this teaching that are so over the top. As I said, Jesus seems to be trying to out-legalize the legalists. First, let's look at the law against murder. Jesus says, "You have heard it said, you shall not murder. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, if you insult a brother or sister, even if you say you fool to a brother or sister, you will be judged." Jesus shocks his audience with this. His words fly in the face of what they've been taught. There is no prohibition in the Hebrew scriptures against anger. So what is Jesus doing exactly? Jesus then tackles the law against adultery and divorce. "You have heard it said," he says, "you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." The word adultery means literally to make something impure, to pollute what should be clean. Far from merely seeing women as property to be coveted by men, Jesus' teaching on adultery and divorce reinforces the dignity of women and warns against the culture of male privilege. In this first century, most women are dependent upon fathers, dependent upon husbands for their daily livelihood. To be used and discarded for another's sexual desires had tremendous repercussions. A woman who had been seduced brought great shame upon her family. A woman who had been raped was considered damaged goods and often turned out. For a young woman, the ability to marry well would be jeopardized. And for those who were married, there was the threat of divorce. Wives could be cast aside for ridiculous reasons. There is even proof that during this time, women could be divorced for burning bread. In contrast to a world where women were treated like property, Jesus' mission and Jesus' vision for what he wanted his kingdom to be allowed women to be disciples. And Jesus is reminding us that when we undermine our relationships with others, ultimately, we undermine our relationship with God. In this third section, Jesus treats the taking of oaths, which is nowhere regarded as a sin in Scripture. In fact, oaths are required in certain circumstances. For example, entering into covenants. This takes us closer to the truth of what Jesus is doing here. We see that Jesus is pushing us. He is pushing us to a place where we are confronted with our behavior from an internal perspective. Jesus is pushing us to a place where what's going to happen is most likely we're going to throw up our hands and say, who can do this? Who can uphold these standards? What are you doing to us? You're killing me. We need to understand that in these teachings, Jesus doesn't just heighten the force of the law. Jesus is broadening it. It is not enough just to refrain from murder. We should also treat each other with respect, and that means not speaking hateful words. It is not enough to avoid physically committing adultery. We should also not objectify other persons by seeing them as means to satisfy our physical desires by lusting after them. It is not enough to follow the letter of the law regarding divorce. We should not treat people as disposable and should make sure that the most vulnerable, and in the culture of the first century Palestine, that often meant women and children, would be provided for. It is not enough to keep ourselves from swearing falsely or lying to others. We should speak and act truthfully in all of our dealings so that we don't need to make any oaths at all. All the hyperbole of cutting off the body parts and burning in hell serve to magnify just how important our relationships are to God. They serve as a reminder that Jesus offers a more radical ethic, a reign of God ethic that is more than actions, and it is about what happens in the heart. It is about what happens in the mind. In this teaching, Jesus reorders the relationships of this world and reorients the internal landscape of our lives. This isn't about a merciless God that would rather have us rip out an eye or cut off a hand just so we can satisfy the law. This is about a God who isn't interested in us keeping the law for the law's sake, but rather that God cares that we keep the law for our sake. Jesus wants his disciples to be people of integrity, people who are faithful to their promises, people who have no need to swear that they are telling the truth because they are truth tellers. They should be people who honor their commitments in marriage and who respect the commitments of others. The women in their midst are not to be people to be used and abandoned at will, but as fellow disciples. They are among the ones who are now blessed by God's reign. I want you to think about this. Jesus is reframing our notions of righteousness in order to expose the easy truths we make. Consider how we can pat ourselves on the back for not committing murder, while we can ruin the reputation of a co-worker through our words. We even call it stabbing someone in the back and think nothing of it. The notion that we must reconcile with anyone who has something against us before we can give our gifts to God stops us in our tracks. Really? Really? There is no easy private relationship to God in these words. Resentment, alienation, estrangement from others prevent me from giving my gifts to God. We can pat ourselves on the back for not committing adultery, and yet we create primary relationships with work and sports and even the internet rather than our spouse or our partner. Jesus shifts our attention from particular behaviors that we must avoid to particular interior orientations that we must cultivate. Kingdom righteousness saturates all our whole lives and promises much more. Kingdom righteousness is about a blessedness, about a new way of being in this world. We find a similar message in Moses' third speech to the people that was found in the text of Deuteronomy, which was read to us. The people are told that today is the day to make choices. I call heaven and earth to witness against you, said Moses. Today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. What does it mean to choose life or to choose death? There is a relationship in this text between God and the people that is embedded in the law. Moses wants the people to value the law and to follow the law, but not to do so without thinking about the intention of the law, the changes in behavior that need to happen when one chooses to obey God. In verses 15 through 19 of Deuteronomy, We find these commands or these methods to be in relationship with God, which is ultimately about choosing life. We are told that we have to love God, to walk in God's ways, to keep God's commandments, statutes, and judgments. And in verse 20, there's a slight modification of language. So the people should love God, should hear God's voice, and should cling to God. What do these mean? To love God involves mind, body, and soul. It involves a holistic commitment to be and to do. It is about intention and motive. Choosing life involves walking in the ways of God and listening to the voice of God and acting on that. Here we have general biblical images of discipleship that establish a clear link between hearing the voice of God and obeying the voice of God. Between knowing and doing. Choosing life involves keeping God's commandments and clinging to God. This admonition reminds us that the Israelites were also expected to act in appropriate ways towards each other and towards God. And for Christians to do this is a mark of religious identity, a clear way to respond to God's initiative. Our relationships matter. How we treat one another matter. How we relate to God matters. It matters to God. And it also mattered to Jesus. Which is why in the narrative from Matthew, as Jesus engages the 10 Commandments, what he is trying to make the disciples understand is that all sin, starts as an inclination of the heart. About our behavior in our relationships to God and to one another. We don't generally get to the point of committing murder or adultery without first experiencing a long and meandering journey of the heart, from peace to violence, or from contentment to restlessness. Jesus is saying, pay attention to your heart. Don't let what starts as perhaps an understandable anger or disappointment in your spouse take you to that place of actions that will cause harm. Jesus is asking, how is your heart? That's where it all begins. When we open our hearts to a relationship with God, we allow that grace to pour in and to saturate our lives, to soak us through and through. And at the same time, we can invite God to search us and to know us and to heal us. When we do that, we are choosing life. Remember, Jesus did not want his disciples to think about the law of God in terms of doing a certain number of impossible things before breakfast, but in terms of being in the right relationship with God and with those around us. This radical ethic that Jesus is teaching is not about our need to do the right thing. It's about loving our neighbor, about controlling our anger, about modifying our desires for personal fulfillment, all to the end that we might be instruments for deepening and strengthening the community in which we live. Because these teachings, my sisters and brothers, are so profound and they're so important because they have to do with the intimate details of our lives, details that are often hidden from human eye and very, very rarely spoken about. Jesus is pushing us, and he's pushing us hard, which is why this is the uh-oh sermon. So we throw up our hands in despair and we cry, who can do this? Who can uphold these standards, Jesus? And the answer is no one. Not anyone sitting here today. It's impossible. Jesus wants his disciples to understand, when we answer this way, two basic realities. The first reality that Jesus wants to make clear to his disciples is that the law is an impossible taskmaster. None of us is ever capable of complete and utter fidelity to it without the grace of God. And here is where what Jesus wants us to know, the second lesson. This is about the good news. This is Jesus' second teaching. We have the grace. We have been given the grace. We have that unexpected revolutionary love of God. We have it no matter who we are or what we have done. We have the love of God through no power of our own, not because of who we are, but because of who God is. And this is good news. This is good news. That the God born in a manger enters the messiness of life in all of its dimensions, seeking to heal and to save. That God offers us a life that is deep and wide, where light shines into every nook and cranny, not a puny, flat life reduced to avoiding the big sins. Jesus gives the disciples a new way of understanding life, not rejecting tradition, but building upon it. Jesus offers a way of life that demands more, but also promises more. Truly, this life that Jesus is offering is life abundant. I have come to give you life. Not the way the world gives it, but an abundant life. This is what we're being offered. So today, February 16th, is Decision Day. Time to rip out the eye? Time to cut the hand? Surely these are difficult images. Preacher went crazy this morning. Yeah, they're difficult images. Yes, they push us. They push us. They push us to see our lives and our relationships in a new way. They push us that we look at ourselves, the intimate nooks and crannies of our lives, in a different lens that's shaped by the radical ethic that Jesus embodied. Remember, Jesus shifts our attention from particular behaviors that we must avoid to particular interior motivations that we should cultivate. Kingdom righteousness. Kingdom righteousness that saturates our whole lives and promises much more. This is a new way of life, and it is the way of blessedness. Today is Decision Day. And what will you choose? What will you choose? It makes no difference what you're struggling with today. Anger, hatred, addiction, despair, lust, greed, jealousy. It does not matter, because God is offering each one of us this morning, right now, to be forever changed. God offers to help us to heal. This is the God whose grace is the answer to our deepest question. This is the God that stands before us and invites us. This is the God that enters the messiness of our lives and who loves us. This is the God that is before you this morning. And now, it's up to us to